afternoon, good evening, depending where everyone is. Um, Thank you for organizing this one, Mario. It's a fabulous idea. Um, it's really wonderful to see Rajesh again and Bud, um, to meet Nina, and to see all these other people that I've never met in person, but would always like to meet. Um, I'm going to be a little bit different from speakers last time and Rajesh, um, because I've really never done participatory action research. I've studied it, but I haven't really engaged in it besides a few tiny little exercises. Um, since about uh, the year 2000, no, before that, the late 90s, I was involved in a collaborative research project with members of the Regional Indigenous Council of Cauca, CRICA, indigenous organization in Southern Colombia. We were trying to do collaborative work, and we realized that each of us had to do our own project, because if we did one project together, I would end up running it. And we wanted people to be more autonomous and to be able to do their work in the ways that they wanted to do it. And we still had to have something that brought us together. And we started developing concepts that came out of the culture of the organization as the guiding theories or concepts that would guide our work. We had lots of meetings, and all the meetings and any interviews that we did for our different projects were transcribed. We had funds for someone to do the transcriptions. One of the transcribers is going to speak in a later session. Her name is Libia Tatay. And Libia reflected on what she was transcribing and talked to me a bit about the dynamics of the team. There were ways in which we worked together, and there were ways in which we clashed. There were rivalries, all kinds of things were going on. And this got me interested in trying to understand what actually happens on a social level in terms of interaction in a collaborative team. Something that I was only partially able to understand in my own experience, because I was enmeshed in it. So I decided I was going to embark on a project where I did an ethnography of a series of collaborative teams in Latin America in different countries. And in order to start this project, in 2007, I decided to visit the recently opened archives of Orlando Fals Borda and his work on the coast of Colombia, on the Atlantic coast, which is where he started to develop his notion of participatory research. And it's an archive that's located in Monteria, which is where Victor Negrete, who spoke last time, lives and works. And I got so enmeshed in this archive that I never did the ethnographic work with the collaborative teams in other places. I'm still involved with Fals Borda. So Fals's archive presents a visitor with what looks like a mishmash of documentation. I mean, there's miles of it, kilometers of it, excuse me. There's photos from all over the Caribbean coast, from a wide range of time periods. There are transcribed interviews with peasant leaders, and a small number of them available in recordings. There's the handwritten autobiography of one of these leaders. There are drafts of pamphlets and projects. There are minutes of meetings. And above all, there are Fals Borda's notebooks and hastily jotted notes, sometimes on the back of paper bags, about all kinds of things. So how was I going to make sense of this? This wasn't a case of going to an archive, finding the material, systematizing it, and writing about it, because it didn't make all that much sense. where would I find the story? Because I knew the story that I wanted to tell, but I didn't know how I was going to tell it, which was the story of what happened. How did they do this research? How did they get along with each other? How did they work with the peasants? So that brings me to the object, which maybe you can show for a moment, that I want to share with you. As you can see, it's a portrait of a man dressed in a Renaissance costume. It's an image that's impassioned me over the past 15 years. It was painted by an artist named Ulianov Chalarka. Victor mentioned him last session. And it's a self-portrait that his brother told me Chalarka intended to place himself in the shoes of Rembrandt. So what does this portrait have to do with participatory action research? The painter, Uliano Chalarka, was enlisted by Falsborda's research team in the early 70s to illustrate a series of graphic narratives, documentary comics, recounting the history of peasant struggles on the Caribbean coast during the first half of the 20th century. Now, for many years, Latin American social movements employed comics as a vehicle for communicating with the base. But these comics that were done by this team in Monteria were different from others because they were constructed using participatory methodologies through which the peasants told their own stories, chose how they would be depicted, and subsequently shared them in events in which the audience was encouraged to use the stories as catalysts for sharing their own experiences. So these comics were a recruitment tool and a consciousness raising tool. And this gave me the story. The comics were the place where I could see how they did what they did. To some degree, I could see how they worked with each other, what differences they might have had, how they built up over, each of these comics took about 6 months to do, how they built up over time, what the story, where they were getting their ideas from, where they were getting their visual prompts from, etc. So I don't have time to go over all the details of how these comics were made, but I'll give a couple of examples, which fit very nicely, by the way, with the whole way that this series of events that Juan Mario organized. You'll see in a second. Participants in Struggles of the Past on the coast shared their memories in public forums. And they did this with a series of objects, photos, documents, armbands that they'd stored away for safekeeping in their homes. Falsborda called these archivos de baúl. I translate that as kitchen archives. So the narrator would tell the story using the objects as prompts. And this resulted in a form of storytelling that follows the personal experience of the narrator instead of a generic model for sharing an autobiography. Another example is the taped interview with a peasant leader, Juana Julia Guzman, who was a leader in the 1920s, but who Fals interviewed in the 1970s, right before her death. And she became an inspiration for the peasant movement in the 70s. And when I looked at the transcription that was in the archives, I thought, well, Fals is such a good interviewer. What happened here? Because there'd be a question and then a one-sentence answer, another question, then a one-sentence answer, until I listened to the tape, because luckily this was one of the few interviews there was a tape for. And I discovered that it was a bunch of peasants interrupting each other, reminiscing. So it wasn't Falsborda asking questions. It was people asking each other questions. And I think it was showing an example of what research would be if you were not an academic. So to go back to the comics, which were what emerged out of all of this other stuff. The comics became a platform for collaboration and for dialogue. And it took me several years to try to figure out who was talking to whom, when, at what moments. So between the researchers and the peasant narrators who were telling their stories many times in front of peasant audiences, between the peasant activists who participated more directly in producing the comic and the artist who would go there for a few days, Chalarca, then at various moments in the process between the research team and the peasant organization, which was guiding what kind of stories they wanted to be told. And then among the participants in the rural audiences in which the comics were read aloud and projected on the screen. I think a lot of what I had to do was speculation. It wasn't directly in the archive. And I got the inspiration from Falsborg of how to do that, I think. These comics would be taken and projected on screens and read aloud. Because many of the peasants in the 70s didn't know how to read. So I did that too. I took the comics from the 70s to communities and we read them. And when I did it in the cities, at universities or public fora, we'd get through the whole comic. These comics are maybe 15 pages long, 20 pages long. We get through the whole thing. When I did it in peasant communities, we get through 3-4 pages because they'd start talking. They'd start telling their own stories, which weren't necessarily the same stories as what's in the comic. And all of these activities started giving me ideas of how I could flesh out this history. Now, the comics show us how participatory action research unfolded over the first half of the 1970s, or they don't show us, they give us a stage in which we can start to imagine how it unfolded. But I also want to recognize something Meghna said in her presentation last time. She said that the project she was working on wasn't only participatory research, it was also feminist research. And in the case of Falsborda's team, this was not only participatory action research, but what today we would call research creation. In other words, the collecting of information and its interpretation happened while researchers and activists were directly involved in producing art. In this case, comics. When they did sociodramas, they were producing theater, they were doing puppetry. This involves a very different sort of thinking than conventional research. This is it's similar to what Rajesh just said about using the senses. It's less abstract, it's more concrete. It doesn't involve necessarily explaining, it involves showing. It's directed at an audience that has to interact more fully with the object than one usually does with written nonfiction, academic writing. Talking from the point of view of comics, we could say that the audience has to inhabit the frames of a comic in order to experience it. Why history? Because I think in other places, participatory action research doesn't necessarily involve history. When Falsborda was beginning to think about his work with the peasant movement, this came before he went to the coast, when he was working with a network of other committed researchers in a group, I'll translate the name, the Circle of Research and social, wait, sorry, I'm thinking of it in Spanish and then in English at the same time. La Rosca de Investigación y Acción Social. The Circle of Research and
social action.
Organizing. They coined a term they called critical recovery, recuperación crítica, which they argued was the centerpiece of their project. So it involved more than just unearthing stories from the past. It wasn't just making comics about history that people would enjoy reading. More specifically, it encompassed learning about particular activities and institutions that were useful in past studies and could be introduced in new forms in the struggles of the present. So it was critical recovery that connected history with activism. And the comics, the art, made these stories into more than entertaining stories. It made them into tools. So this leads me to the question of why didn't I choose one of Chalarka's comics panels as my object? Instead, I selected a self-portrait in early modern dress. When you're engaging in historical analysis, I think that you need some sort of personal connection to the people whose documentary and visual traces you're following. They need to become your friends. In my experience studying 16th century Bogota, I made friends with even some of the most nasty of the colonial overlords, because that's how I could begin to imagine them moving around in their world. I never met Chalarca. Chalarca died way before I ever got to Monteria. I had to imagine him. Now, Fals and his team also made people from the past, especially peasant leaders from the past, their friends. They do this in comics by highlighting the connections between the past and the present of their audiences. They have narrators who are people that are known in the community. Some of them were young, some of them were older. Juana Julia Guzman is one of the narrators in one of the comics. It makes the audiences feel they're in some way linked to the narrative. And Fals called this an act of senti pensar, thinking, feeling, which is very cumbersome in English, but sounds really good in Spanish. So Sai somehow had to enter into Chalarca's life. He has been described to me as a reserved person. He was still single in his 30s. He lived in a working class neighborhood in a house whose outer walls and roof he decorated with pre-Columbian motifs, which led his neighbors to call it La Esquina del Diablo, the Devil's Corner. He made his living painting portraits of local personages or working on what was almost an assembly line of canvases depicting saints, which were then sold to local people who wanted pictures of saints or Christ or the Virgin in their houses. There used to be a bar in Monteria that lots of people frequented, on whose walls there were landscape paintings by Chalarca. He produced at least 3 self-portraits, the one I shared with you, another in which he looks like a muscle man, I don't like that one that much, and a kind of eerie canvas in which only his face appears like a death mask. Now, in contrast to his public persona as someone whose paintings were on the wall of a bar, etc., his work with Fals Borda was kept secret from his neighbors for fear of government repression. I've spent hours with his brother Orlando, who's also a painter, and with his artist nephew Tamaro, because the whole family, that this was their job. They were local artists who made paintings and did caricatures in local newspapers. While I interpret Chalarca's thought processes through his comics panels, I catch a glimpse of him as a person when I gaze at this self-portrait, where he imagines himself as an old master. His studio contains multiple copies of drawings and paintings copied from the masters. He was a self-taught artist. Thus, I think it's appropriate that my object comes from the personal life of this man, who inhabited a barrio populated by peasants who'd been driven from the haciendas, who learned his craft through personal experience, and interacted on a daily basis with people like Orlando Fals Borda and Victor Negrete, as well as with leaders of the peasant movement and all of the eyewitnesses to the agrarian struggles of the past. So this picture was really my window into the history of participatory action research on the Caribbean coast of Colombia. And that's where I end.